My wife and her lover mocked me in court thinking I lost, but their smirks vanished in seconds. Everything I thought I knew was a lie. My wife, my marriage, my life, it all came crashing down in an instant. She and her lover thought they'd won, thought I'd lost it all. But what they didn't know, I had a plan that left them reeling. Stay with me as I reveal how I turned the tables, exposed the truth, and reclaimed everything I had lost. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air bites at your face just enough to wake you up, but not enough to make you want to stay inside. The sky stretched out above the courthouse, a soft, steel gray with clouds drifting lazily like they had all the time in the world. I stepped out of my truck, took a deep breath, and adjusted the cuffs on my suit. Navy blue. Tailored. I wasn't wearing it for her, or the judge, or even the spectators who trickled in for the drama. I wore it because I wanted to feel like myself again, a man who still had some control. My polished dress shoes clicked against the pavement as I made my way toward the courthouse steps. Their sound deliberate, steady. I glanced at the big digital clock mounted near the entrance. 10:45. My divorce hearing had been underway for 45 minutes already, and I wasn't in a rush. Let them sit there and wonder. Let her smirk and lean into Ryan, convinced they'd already won. That's what I wanted. The thought made me almost smile. Almost. It wasn't anger that filled me anymore, not the kind that made my hands tremble or my jaw clench. I'd burned through that months ago. What I felt now was something cooler, sharper. A sense of focus. The kind of focus you get after spending night after night, going over every detail, every conversation, every clue that something was wrong. I hadn't just stumbled into this hearing unprepared. I'd mapped out every move, every word. The game they thought they were playing? I was already 10 steps ahead. I reached the top of the steps and pulled open one of the heavy courthouse doors. The familiar smells hit me: polished wood, cheap coffee, faint traces of old paper. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with activity. Lawyers shuffled past me, their eyes focused on the next big case, their leather briefcases bouncing against their sides. A clerk hurried by, balancing a stack of papers so high, I wondered if she could even see where she was going. The sound of heels clicking on tile, and hushed voices arguing over legal jargon filled the air. I paused for a moment, taking it all in. It felt strange, standing here, knowing what was coming. Knowing that I'd spent months orchestrating every second of this moment. A small part of me, the part that still remembered how things used to be, felt the sting of it. This was the woman I had once loved, the one I had built a home and a life with. Now she was someone I didn't recognize. Someone who would sit in that courtroom and lie without blinking. Someone who thought she could strip away everything I'd worked for and walk out with her head held high. I moved down the hallway, passing courtroom 304. That was the room. I could hear faint murmurs from inside, the rustle of papers, the occasional sound of a throat being cleared. And then I heard her laugh, light, almost musical. It was the laugh she used to pull me in, back when I thought it was genuine. But now I knew better. That laugh was a weapon. It was how she let you know she was winning. My steps slowed. I stood just outside the door, listening. I could picture her in there, leaning toward Ryan, that smug look on her face. Ryan would be smiling too, pretending he hadn't just walked into our lives and blown everything apart. They probably thought my being late was a sign of weakness, that I was too broken to show up on time, that I was scared. But they didn't know me. Not really. I reached for the door handle and paused. For one brief moment, I closed my eyes and let the memory of all the sleepless nights, the unanswered questions, and the sudden, sharp betrayals wash over me. Then I opened the door and stepped inside. The room went silent. The kind of silence that makes you feel the weight of every pair of eyes turning toward you. I kept my gaze steady as I walked down the aisle, not looking at anyone in particular. But I could feel her watching me. I could feel that smirk start to falter. She didn't look scared, not yet. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Something that told me she knew, on some level, that this wasn't going to go the way she thought. Ryan's smile didn't waver. He leaned back slightly, as if he owned the room. But I noticed the subtle shift in his posture, the way his hands twitched for a second before he clasped them together. Confidence was easy to fake. I knew that better than anyone. The judge cleared his throat, bringing everyone back to attention. I took my seat, placing my briefcase carefully beside me. I didn't open it, didn't look at it. I just sat there, my hands folded, my expression calm. Emily's lawyer, a polished man with a voice that sounded like it belonged in an infomercial, sneered at me. "Nice of you to join us," he said, the condescension dripping from his words. I didn't respond. Instead, I glanced at Emily. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She tilted her head, her voice mockingly sweet. "You're late." I met her gaze evenly. "I know," I replied, my voice calm and measured. "But I wouldn't miss this for the world." That's when I saw it, that brief flicker of doubt. She masked it quickly, but it was there. For the first time, I thought she might actually be wondering what I was doing. Her lawyer stood, his rehearsed opening statements flowing effortlessly. He painted a picture of me as a reckless, irresponsible husband who had neglected his family, wasted our finances, and failed as a father. It was a well-crafted performance. He knew exactly when to pause for effect, when to glance toward the judge, when to lower his voice as if he were sharing some tragic secret. I stayed silent. No objections, no interruptions. I let him talk. Let them think they were winning. The longer they felt in control, the sweeter their fall would be. When it was finally my turn, I rose slowly. The room felt heavier now, as if everyone was leaning forward just slightly, waiting for me to speak. I adjusted my tie and nodded politely toward the judge. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady. "I'd like to apologize for my tardiness. I had some urgent matters to attend to this morning, matters that I believe will shed some light on the issues before us." The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't look at Emily, but I could feel her eyes on me. I could almost hear her thoughts, the panic rising. Ryan shifted in his seat, his smug expression starting to crack. I kept my tone even, polite, but I could feel the tension building, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. I reached for my briefcase, my movements slow, deliberate. I wasn't in a rush. Timing was everything. As I placed the first document on the table, I saw at the moment her smirk vanished completely. And that was only the beginning. When Emily's lawyer took the floor, I knew exactly what was coming. I'd seen the polished show before, the carefully rehearsed monologue designed to paint me as a failure, a man incapable of handling his own finances, let alone raising a child. He spoke with a kind of smug assurance, each word dripping with condescension. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth as silk, "my client has endured unimaginable hardship at the hands of Mr. Coleman. Financial instability, emotional neglect, a pattern of irresponsibility that makes it clear he is not fit to retain custody of their son." His tone was measured, deliberate, as though every sentence was part of a grand performance. I kept my expression neutral, my hands resting calmly on the table, but inside, I could feel the familiar stirrings of frustration. Not anger, no, that would have been too simple. It was something more insidious, a cold undercurrent of disbelief that someone could lie so effortlessly, so convincingly. Emily sat just a few feet away, her posture perfect, her face composed in a mask of mild distress. She nodded at the right moments, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue whenever the lawyer hit an emotional high note. It was all so well timed, so rehearsed, I almost had to admire it. Almost. I'd once believed that face, that carefully arranged expression of innocence and vulnerability. I'd fallen for it more times than I cared to admit. But now, I saw it for what it was, a facade. A tool she wielded with precision to bend people to her will. And today, her target wasn't just me, it was the entire courtroom. Her lawyer's voice rose slightly, his tone sharpening as he described me as a man who couldn't manage his finances, who had squandered opportunities, who was too distracted and disorganized to be a proper father. He leaned into the details, citing dates, amounts, carefully selected incidents that, taken out of context, made me look careless at best and negligent at worst. It was a performance, plain and simple, and he played his role to perfection. I glanced toward the judge, who remained impassive, his gaze flicking between the lawyer and his notes. I knew this judge's reputation: fair, thorough, and not easily swayed by theatrics. But that didn't mean I could relax. Emily's lawyer wasn't just throwing accusations into the air, he was laying a foundation, one stone at a time, building a narrative that could tip the scales in her favor. "Your Honor," the lawyer continued, My client has worked tirelessly to provide stability for her son, despite Mr. Coleman's repeated financial missteps. She has been the steady presence, the reliable parent. In contrast, Mr. Coleman has demonstrated a pattern of instability that raises serious concerns about his ability to maintain a secure and supportive environment. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, glancing briefly at the judge before continuing. This isn't about punishing Mr. Coleman, it's about protecting a child, about ensuring that the best interests of this young boy are upheld. I could feel the weight of the courtroom's gaze shifting toward me, silent judgment in the air. Emily's lawyer turned slightly, gesturing toward her, as if she were some kind of saint. My client, he said, his voice softening, has endured the strain of Mr. Coleman's financial recklessness, his inability to meet deadlines, his lack of planning. Yet she has never wavered in her dedication to their son. She has provided a safe, nurturing home, despite the challenges Mr. Coleman's actions have caused. Emily bowed her head slightly, her hands folded in her lap, the very picture of quiet resilience. I could almost hear the unspoken thought running through the room. Poor Emily. How she must have suffered. It was a carefully crafted narrative, and I had no doubt it had been rehearsed down to the last syllable. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that I had my own story to tell. I wasn't here to plead for mercy or to apologize for mistakes I hadn't made. I was here to set the record straight, to dismantle the web of lies they'd spun around me. As Emily's lawyer droned on, citing more supposed instances of my financial mismanagement, I kept my gaze steady, never breaking my calm exterior. I'd learned long ago that the truth had a weight of its own. It didn't need theatrics. It didn't need embellishment. It just needed to be revealed, piece by piece, until it became undeniable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lawyer concluded his statement, thanking the court for its attention and taking his seat. The silence that followed was thick, the kind that makes you aware of every rustle of paper, every cough, every subtle shift in posture. The judge looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Coleman," he said, his voice even, "do you have anything to say in response?" I stood slowly, adjusting my tie with a deliberate motion. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. When I spoke, my tone was calm, measured, each word chosen carefully. "Your Honor," I began, "I'd like to start by addressing some of the claims made against me. I understand the concerns that have been raised, but I believe it's important to look at the full picture, not just selected moments taken out of context." I paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. There's no denying that this process has been difficult for everyone involved. But what we're dealing with here isn't a simple matter of finances or personality conflicts. It's about the truth. It's about what's best for my son. As I spoke, I noticed Emily shift in her seat, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Ryan, sitting behind her, leaned back slightly, his arms crossed, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He looked at me like I was an afterthought, like I was already beaten. But he didn't know what was coming. They both thought they were in control, that the narrative had been set, that the court would see me as nothing more than a failed father clinging to excuses. They didn't realize that I'd spent months preparing for this moment. I'd gathered every piece of evidence, every document, every record. I'd traced the money, followed the paper trail. I'd pieced together the conversations, the text messages, the financial discrepancies. I wasn't here to argue. I was here to prove, once and for all, that their story was built on lies. I placed my hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. "Your Honor," I continued, "I'd like to request permission to present additional evidence that I believe will provide clarity to these proceedings." The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Proceed." I reached for my briefcase, pulling out a folder of documents. My movements were slow, deliberate, each step carefully measured. I didn't need to look at Emily to know she was watching, to know that doubt was beginning to creep in. Ryan's smirk faded ever so slightly, his posture stiffening. They had come into this courtroom believing they had already won, but that confidence was starting to crack. I laid the first document on the table, a detailed summary of financial transactions spanning the past year. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is a record of withdrawals from our joint account. Significant amounts, taken in increments, and deposited into a private account under my wife's name." I glanced up, meeting the judge's gaze. These withdrawals were not discussed or approved by me. They were made without my knowledge, and were used to fund personal expenses, vacations, luxury items, even a down payment on a separate apartment. The courtroom was silent. I could feel the tension building, the weight of the revelation hanging in the air. Emily's lawyer stood quickly, his voice rising. Your Honor, I must object. These financial matters were already addressed in the initial filings. This is an attempt to distract from the central issue. The judge held up a hand, cutting him off. I'll allow it. The lawyer sat down, his face tight, his confidence visibly shaken. I didn't look at him. My focus was on the judge, on the facts I was presenting, on the truth that could no longer be ignored. As I laid out the evidence, bank statements, transaction records, even text messages between Emily and Ryan discussing their financial plans, I could see the shift in the room. The judge's expression grew more serious. The gallery, once restless, now sat in rapt attention. Emily's hands trembled slightly, her face pale. Ryan's confident posture dissolved, replaced by a subtle but unmistakable tension. I wasn't just telling a story anymore. I was dismantling theirs. Piece by piece, brick by brick, I was tearing down the facade they had built. And as the reality of what I was saying settled over the courtroom, I could see it in their faces. They weren't as untouchable as they thought. Their carefully constructed narrative was crumbling, and they knew it. What would you do if the people you trusted most turned on you? How far would you go to uncover the truth? She thought she'd outsmarted me, but the evidence I had was undeniable. Comment 1 if you think she confessed right away. Comment 2 if you think she tried to fight back. I took my time. That's what they didn't expect. I could feel their eyes on me as I moved deliberately, slowly pulling out a stack of documents from my briefcase. I didn't rush, didn't stumble. I wanted them to see my hands steady as I laid the first sheet on the table. Your Honor, I began, my voice low but clear, I'd like to submit these records into evidence. They detail a series of financial transactions over the past year. Significant amounts withdrawn from our joint account, unauthorized withdrawals, all leading to a private account under my wife's name. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the courtroom. I felt the room grow still. Emily stiffened beside her lawyer, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Ryan, who had been leaning back with his usual air of smug indifference, straightened up, his eyebrows drawing together in a faint frown. Good. That's exactly what I wanted. For months, they had both acted as though their lies were unassailable, their actions invisible. They thought they could take everything and walk away untouched. But they were wrong. I continued, laying another document down. These withdrawals were made in increments several $1,000s at a time, spread out over the course of 12 months. Not a single one of these transfers was discussed with me, nor were they for shared household expenses. Instead, they were used to finance personal vacations, high-end jewelry, and other luxury items. In short, my wife was siphoning money from our joint account to fund a lifestyle she hid from me. My gaze shifted to the judge, whose expression had grown notably more serious. Emily's lawyer stood abruptly, his voice sharp. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The financial division is being handled separately. Mr. Coleman is attempting to derail the proceedings. Sit down, the judge said firmly, cutting him off. I'll allow it. The lawyer's mouth snapped shut, and he sank back into his chair, his jaw tight. Emily shot him a quick glance, her lips pressed into a thin line. I knew she wasn't panicking yet. She had a talent for keeping her emotions tightly controlled, but I could see the cracks starting to form. The slight twitch in her fingers, the way her shoulders tensed. She had never expected me to fight back like this. Ryan, however, was another story. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his previous confidence fading. I saw his smirk disappear as his eyes darted to Emily, then back to me. He wasn't used to being called out in public, especially not in a courtroom full of people. He had walked into my life pretending to be a friend, smiling that easy smile of his, shaking my hand while he plotted behind my back. He probably thought I was too blind to see it, too trusting to question him. And for a while, I had been. But now, here he was, forced to sit and watch as every step of their deception was laid bare for everyone to see. I pulled out another document, this one more damning than the last. Your Honor, this is a lease agreement for an apartment in downtown Los Angeles. It's under my wife's name and was secured with funds taken from our joint account. This apartment was never disclosed to me, nor was it ever intended for our family. In fact, I glanced at Emily, whose face had turned pale. It was intended solely for my wife and her lover. The room erupted into murmurs, the spectators whispering to each other as the weight of my evidence began to sink in. Emily's lawyer shot to his feet again, sputtering. "Objection. This is not overruled," the judge said, his voice firm. "Mr. Coleman, you may proceed." I didn't look at Emily's lawyer. He was just another piece on the board, and I'd already accounted for his moves. I focused on the evidence in front of me, flipping to the next page. "This document," I said, sliding it toward the judge, "shows a detailed timeline of withdrawals made just days before major purchases. Each withdrawal corresponds directly with a personal expense trips to luxury resorts, high-end retail stores, expensive dining experiences, all of which took place while my wife assured me that she was working late or attending business functions." I paused again, looking around the room. The numbers don't lie. These aren't accidents or oversights. This was deliberate. For the first time, Emily broke her silence. "That's not true," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, trying to calm her, but she shook it off. "Jack, you're twisting this. You know things weren't that simple." I met her gaze for a moment, then turned back to the judge. "The records speak for themselves, Your Honor." I let the silence stretch for a moment before continuing. "This isn't about being simple or complicated. It's about the truth. These transactions weren't shared expenses. They weren't made for our household. They were made to finance a separate life, a life she hid from me, while pretending everything was fine." Ryan's eyes darted around the room, his discomfort now obvious. He leaned forward slightly, as if trying to signal Emily, but she didn't look at him. She was too busy trying to maintain her composure. I knew that look, the one she wore when she was trying to hold it all together. She'd worn it the day I confronted her about the first unexplained expense. The day she fed me a half-truth wrapped in a smile. Back then, I had believed her. I'd wanted to believe her. Not anymore. I laid down one final document, the one I knew would seal this part of my case. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is a bank statement showing a wire transfer from our joint account to a private financial advisor. The funds were then funneled into an offshore account under my wife's name. These aren't just careless expenditures. These are deliberate actions taken to conceal money." I straightened, meeting the judge's eyes. "Your Honor, the pattern here is clear. My wife didn't just mishandle our finances, she actively deceived me, taking advantage of our shared resources to build a life that excluded me entirely." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Emily's lawyer seemed at a loss for words. His face flushed as he shuffled his papers. Emily sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Ryan looked like he wanted to be anywhere but there. I stepped back from the table, letting my words hang in the air. I'd laid out the facts, the evidence, everything they'd tried to hide. The room felt heavy, the kind of heavy that only comes when the truth is finally dragged into the light. I wasn't finished, not by a long shot. But for now, I let them sit with it. Let them feel the weight of their lies, knowing that this was just the beginning. With the financial records laid bare, and the air in the courtroom heavy with tension, I could feel the tide shifting. But this wasn't just about the money. That was only one piece of the puzzle. I had to show them the bigger picture, the calculated betrayal, the lies stacked so high they threatened to topple over, and the cold, deliberate decisions Emily had made to keep me in the dark. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the edge of the table. My voice stayed calm, but I let the weight of what I was saying come through. "Your Honor," I said, "the financial evidence I've presented is only part of the story. What's at the heart of this case isn't just the missing funds. It's the pattern of deceit that my wife and her lover wove around me and my son." Emily's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly bracing for what was coming next. I glanced at the judge, then back at the documents in front of me. "Over the past several months," I continued, "I've uncovered a trail of communications between my wife and her lover, Mr. Carter. These aren't just friendly conversations or idle remarks. They're plans to remove me from my own life, to take my son from me, and to rewrite our history as though I never existed." I could feel the room holding its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. I could tell they were all waiting for me to pull out another damning piece of evidence, to drop the next bombshell. But I wasn't going to rush. Timing was everything. I paused, letting the silence stretch out before carefully pulling out a file from my briefcase. I opened it, and laid a series of highlighted text messages and emails on the table. These are communications between my wife and Mr. Carter, I said, my voice steady. In these messages, they openly discuss their intentions to divorce me and gain full custody of our son, not because it's what's best for him, but because they believed it would give them leverage in securing the house, additional alimony, and control over our finances. The judge leaned forward slightly, examining the papers. I could hear the faint rustle of clothing as spectators shifted in their seats. Emily's lawyer reached for his pen, scribbling furiously on his notepad. Emily finally spoke up, her voice trembling. Those messages are taken out of context. You're twisting this to make me look like a monster. I turned to her, my expression calm but firm. They're your words, I said quietly. No one twisted anything. Her lawyer raised a hand. Your Honor, I'd like to object. Overruled, the judge said, his tone clipped. He motioned for me to continue. I nodded, turning back to the table. What's more concerning, Your Honor, I said, is that my wife and her lover don't just talk about their plans. They boast about how easy it will be. In one message, she wrote, Jack will never see it coming. He's too good of a father to fight back the way we need him to. I let the words hang in the air for a moment. I didn't need to explain what that meant. Everyone in that room understood. She was going to use the fact that I was a good father something I had always taken pride in against me. The judge's face hardened, his pen tapping against the edge of his desk. Mr. Coleman, he said, do you have any additional evidence to support these claims? Yes, Your Honor, I replied. I reached into the briefcase again and pulled out another set of documents. These are affidavits from our son's teachers and daycare providers. They describe multiple instances where my wife failed to pick him up on time, or didn't show up at all, leaving me to rearrange my work schedule to cover for her. They also detail occasions when my son came to school upset because he'd been left alone, or because he overheard arguments between my wife and Mr. Carter. I set the papers down, my hand steady. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a pattern that shows my wife putting her personal life and her relationship with Mr. Carter above the well-being of our son. I heard a faint gasp from the back of the room, followed by hurried whispers. I didn't look back. My focus was on the judge, on the truth, on the weight of what I was laying out piece by piece. Emily's lawyer stood again, his face red. Your Honor, this is character assassination. None of this is relevant to the financial matters at hand. The judge cut him off. This is a custody case as well. Counsel, I find it highly relevant. Continue, Mr. Coleman. I nodded and turned back to the documents. Finally, I said, I have video evidence. On 3 separate occasions, my wife left our son alone at home, while she spent the night at Mr. Carter's residence. In one video, our son can be heard calling me on his tablet, crying because he was scared and didn't know where his mother was. I heard the courtroom inhale sharply. Emily's hands were shaking now. Her lawyer looked ready to crawl under the table. I met the judge's eyes. Your Honor, this is no longer just about financial irresponsibility or marital disputes. This is about the safety and well-being of my son. I'm not here to argue over money. I'm here to protect him. I stepped back, letting my words sink in. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the room was on Emily, who sat frozen, her face pale, her fingers clenching the edge of the table so tightly I thought she might snap it in half. Ryan, sitting behind her, had gone completely still. He wasn't smiling anymore. If anything, he looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the silence. We will take a short recess, he said. His voice even but firm. He looked down at the papers in front of him. When we reconvene, I expect the defendant's counsel to respond to these allegations. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the courtroom erupted into hushed whispers. I didn't move. I stayed in my seat, watching as Emily leaned toward her lawyer, whispering frantically. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. I could see it in their faces, the realization that their plan was falling apart, that the story they had spun so carefully was unraveling right in front of them. For months, they had thought they could play me, that they could walk into this courtroom and paint me as the villain. But now, with the evidence laid bare, With their lies exposed, they were the ones scrambling. I sat back, folding my hands on the table, and allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. They weren't as untouchable as they thought. This was just the beginning. The silence that settled over the courtroom was unlike anything I'd felt before. It wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating, heavy. The air was thick with tension. The kind that made you hyper-aware of every small sound. The shuffle of papers. The clearing of a throat. The faint creak of someone shifting in their seat. I let the moment stretch, my hands resting on the table, my face unreadable. I wanted them to feel the weight of what I'd just revealed, to realize that I wasn't here to be torn down or dismissed. I was here to tell the truth, and I wasn't leaving until it was heard. Emily's lawyer looked like he'd just swallowed something sour. His confident, polished demeanor had cracked under the pressure. He sat stiffly in his chair, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against his notepad. I could see him glancing at the judge, then at Emily, then back at his notes, as if hoping some new line of defense might suddenly appear. But there was no defense, not against what I'd shown them. Not against the texts, the financial records, the video of my son crying for his mother, while she was off living a life that didn't include us. It wasn't just evidence, it was a story, a damning one, and it was sinking in now. Like a stone dropping through still water. Emily sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her knuckles white, her lips pressed into a thin line. She was trying to hold on, trying to keep up the facade, but it wasn't working. I knew that look. I'd seen it before, back when she'd first realized I was starting to suspect something. She would smile, brush it off, insist I was imagining things, but I could see it in her eyes, that flicker of doubt, the smallest crack in the mask. And now, that crack was widening. She wasn't smiling anymore. She wasn't brushing anything off. She was sitting there, frozen, as if staying still could somehow undo everything that had just unfolded. Behind her, Ryan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his face a mask of strained indifference. He wasn't smirking anymore. In fact, he wasn't even looking at me. He was staring at the far wall, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against his bicep. I could tell he wanted to say something, to break the silence, to regain some sense of control. But what could he say? The evidence was right there, laid out for everyone to see. His words, his plans, his role in all of it, there was no denying it now. He had strutted into this courtroom like he owned the place, like he and Emily had already won. And now he looked like a man who was realizing he'd backed the wrong horse. I straightened in my seat, exhaling slowly. "Your Honor," I said, my voice calm, steady. "I understand that this evidence is difficult to hear. It's not easy for me to present it. But I believe it's necessary, because this case isn't just about money or property. It's about my son. It's about what's best for him. And I can't stand by while he's treated like a pawn in someone else's game." I let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "I know it's not easy to sit here and listen to this. But I've spent the last year living it. And I'm here now because I refuse to let it go unanswered." The judge leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. His expression was hard to read, neutral, but not indifferent. I could tell he was listening closely, weighing everything I said. He wasn't the type to be swayed by theatrics or emotion alone. He wanted facts, evidence, a clear picture. And that's what I intended to give him. I didn't need to embellish or dramatize. The truth was damning enough on its own. As I spoke, I noticed a shift in the room. The spectators' friends, family, curious onlookers had gone from casual observers to rapt listeners. I could see it in their faces. The way their eyes stayed fixed on me. The way their expressions changed as the story unfolded. They weren't just hearing facts. They were seeing the cracks in Emily's narrative. The lies that had been carefully constructed, and now lay exposed under the harsh light of the courtroom. It wasn't just me against them anymore. It was the truth standing up against a web of deception. And the truth was starting to win. Emily's lawyer finally found his voice. He cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and stood. "Your Honor," he began, his tone controlled but strained, "my client acknowledges that mistakes were made. She understands that certain actions may have been misconstrued. I cut in, my tone sharp. "You don't misconstrue a year's worth of financial manipulation. You don't misconstrue leaving a child alone in an empty house. You don't misconstrue text messages plotting how to take custody of a son you don't even want, just so you can get more money. The judge raised a hand, signaling for order, but I could see it in his face he wasn't going to entertain vague excuses. Emily's lawyer floundered, his words faltering as he tried to regain control. Your Honor, my client. The judge cut him off. I think we've heard enough, counsel. Let's move on. The lawyer hesitated, then sat down, his face pale. He knew, just like Emily knew, just like Ryan knew, that they had lost control of the narrative. And once you lose control of the narrative, it's only a matter of time before the truth becomes undeniable. I stayed silent, letting the room settle again. My work here wasn't done, but I could feel the momentum shifting. They'd walked into this courtroom confident, arrogant, certain they could spin their lies into something resembling truth. But now, they were cornered. And I was just getting started. It wasn't just the evidence or the questions from the judge that were turning the tide. It was the silence that followed each piece of truth I brought to light. It was the way Emily's composure began to crack, the way Ryan's smug confidence evaporated. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on them now, even if they tried to keep their faces blank. And for the first time, I felt the momentum shifting fully to my side. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. But I knew this was the moment where their house of cards would start to crumble. I leaned forward again, my voice calm, steady, and deliberate. Your Honor, I said, I have one final piece of evidence that ties everything together. It's the answer to the question that's been hanging in the air since this began. Why? Why would she go to such lengths, take such risks, and involve him in this mess? The judge nodded, his gaze steady. I took a deep breath, knowing this would hit hard, but that was the point. Because it wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about getting the house or the alimony. It was about control. Emily and her lover didn't just want to leave me. They wanted to rewrite the narrative, paint me as the villain, and ensure I had no way to fight back. They didn't want a clean break. They wanted me out of my own life. I pulled out the last document from my briefcase, sliding it across the table. These are emails and text exchanges between Emily and Mr. Carter. In them, they discuss a plan, one that goes beyond simply ending our marriage. They talk about using false accusations, about creating a paper trail to make me look irresponsible, unfit, and financially unstable. They wanted to make sure that by the time we got to court, I wouldn't just lose my family, I'd lose my credibility, my reputation, and any chance of rebuilding my life. I could feel the air in the room grow colder. Emily's lawyer looked like he wanted to object, but he stayed silent, probably knowing it would only make things worse. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his arms crossed tightly, his jaw clenched. For the first time, he looked at Emily, and I could see the blame starting to bubble up, the cracks forming in their united front. They had come in here together, smirking, confident, and now they were starting to turn on each other. I glanced at Emily. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of the table. She wouldn't look at me, or at anyone. Her eyes stayed fixed on the surface in front of her, as if she could somehow will the truth away. But the damage was done. I had laid everything out, piece by piece, and now the weight of her actions was bearing down on her. She couldn't hide behind half-truths or charm her way out of this. The lies had caught up to her. The judge flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed. I could tell he was reading the messages carefully, piecing the story together in his mind. When he looked up, his expression was harder, colder. Mrs. Coleman, he said, his voice steady but firm. Do you have anything to say about these accusations? Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out. She glanced at her lawyer, who leaned in to whisper something, but she shook her head, her shoulders sagging. She knew as well as I did that no excuse would hold water now. The room was still, the kind of stillness that's heavier than noise, and for the first time, it felt like justice was within reach. I took another breath, steadying myself. Your Honor, I said, I didn't come here to attack anyone. I came here to tell the truth, to make sure that my son and I aren't erased from our own lives. Everything I've shown you today points to a pattern of deception, manipulation, and control. I'm asking this court to see it for what it is, a calculated attempt to take everything from me, and to hurt me in the process. I'm here because I refuse to let them succeed. I leaned back slightly, letting my words sink in. I had said what needed to be said. The evidence was on the table, the truth laid bare. Now, all I could do was wait. The judge sat in silence for a moment, then set the papers down. "We will take a brief recess before continuing," he said, his tone even but firm. He stood, and the gavel came down with a sharp crack. As the courtroom began to empty, I stayed in my seat, watching as Emily and her lawyer huddled together, whispering urgently. Ryan stayed back, his arms crossed, a scowl deepening on his face. He looked at Emily like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. The tension between them was palpable, and I could tell that their carefully constructed alliance was starting to fray. They weren't as united as they had pretended to be. The weight of the truth was pulling them apart, and I could see it happening right in front of me. I let out a slow breath, feeling the tightness in my chest begin to ease. For months, I had carried the weight of their lies, their plans, and their betrayal. I had replayed every conversation, every subtle insult, every moment that didn't add up. And now I had finally brought it all into the light. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time, it felt like I had a real chance to set things right. The fight wasn't done, but I was ready. I wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. The judge's gavel came down hard, cutting through the tension like a crack of thunder. I knew what was coming next. I'd seen it in his face the moment I introduced that last piece of evidence. His tone was measured but firm, the kind of voice that told you he had already made up his mind. "Mrs. Coleman, please stand," he said, and I watched as Emily hesitated, her movement slower than usual. She finally rose from her chair, and for the first time, she looked small, fragile even. Her lawyer whispered something to her, his tone urgent, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the judge, and I could see the mask she'd been wearing start to slip. The judge adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the papers in front of him. "The evidence presented today," he began, "has raised significant questions about the claims made by the defendant. The financial discrepancies, the documented neglect of the minor child, and the communications outlining a premeditated plan to undermine Mr. Coleman's role as a father are deeply troubling." His words were slow, deliberate. Each one landed like a hammer on an anvil. I sat there, my hands folded on the table, trying to keep my breathing steady. I knew this moment would come, but hearing it now, seeing the weight of the truth crush down on her, was something else entirely. "Mr. Coleman," the judge said, turning to me, "do you have any further comments before I make my ruling?" I stood, my legs steady beneath me. I took a deep breath. "Your Honor," I said, my voice calm, "I think the evidence speaks for itself. All I want is what's best for my son. I want him to have a stable, safe environment, and I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to make that happen. That's all I have to say." The judge nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "Very well. Please be seated." I sat back down, my heart pounding in my chest. The judge looked back at Emily. She was still standing, her shoulders hunched slightly, her hands clasped together so tightly I thought she might crack her knuckles. Her lawyer shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. I could tell he wanted to say something, to object or argue or plead, but there was nothing left. The courtroom was still, the air so heavy it felt hard to breathe. The judge cleared his throat. "Given the nature of the evidence and the testimony heard today, I am granting full legal and physical custody of the minor child, Liam Coleman, to Mr. Coleman." My ears rang. I had expected it, hoped for it, but hearing it out loud sent a wave of relief washing over me. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my chest felt lighter, my mind quieter. The judge's voice continued, each word solidifying what I had fought so hard for. "Furthermore, the marital home and remaining joint financial accounts will remain in Mr. Coleman's possession. Miss S. Coleman will retain visitation rights, pending a review of her living situation and adherence to court-ordered guidelines." Emily's reaction was almost imperceptible at first. Her breath hitched. Her head dipped slightly, her fingers twitching as they gripped the table in front of her. Her lawyer whispered something again, but she barely moved. I could see it now, the realization sinking in. The smirk she had walked in with, the confidence, the certainty that she would walk out victorious, it was gone. What replaced it was something raw and unguarded. For a moment, I thought she might cry, but then her jaw tightened, her chin lifted slightly. She was still fighting, if only in her mind. But the truth was clear to everyone in the room. She had lost. Ryan, who had been sitting a few feet behind her, shifted in his seat. His arms were crossed, his face pale. He avoided looking at her, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for a way out. I had been waiting for this moment for the cracks in their alliance to show. They had come in here together, acting like they were untouchable. Now, they wouldn't even look at each other. The judge leaned back in his chair. "This concludes today's proceedings," he said, his voice firm. "Court is adjourned." The gavel struck, sharp and final. The courtroom erupted into motion, lawyers gathering papers, reporters scribbling furiously, the hum of voices rising as people began to file out. I stayed seated for a moment, watching as Emily slowly lowered herself back into her chair. She looked dazed, like someone had knocked the wind out of her, and she was struggling to find her breath. Her lawyer stood, gesturing for her to follow, but she stayed put. She stared at the table, unmoving, her shoulders slumped. Ryan stood abruptly, shoving his chair back with a loud scrape. He didn't say a word to Emily. Instead, he turned and walked out of the courtroom, his footsteps quick and purposeful. Emily's lawyer said something to her, a note of frustration in his voice, but she didn't respond. Finally, he shook his head and followed Ryan out, leaving her sitting there alone. I sat still, watching her, waiting to see if she would look at me, if she would say something. But she didn't. She just sat there, staring at the papers in front of her, her expression blank. I stood, gathering my things. Harris, my attorney, walked over and gave me a small nod. "That was solid," he said quietly. I nodded back, not trusting myself to speak yet. We walked toward the exit together, the courtroom emptying around us. I could feel eyes on me as I passed the reporters, the spectators, the people who had followed this case from the beginning. I kept my head high, my steps steady. I didn't look back. The storm was behind me now. It was time to move forward. The courtroom was emptying out, but I lingered, watching Emily. She was still in her seat, hunched forward, staring down at the table as if the verdict might change if she concentrated hard enough. For a brief moment, I felt the stir of something I hadn't expected: sympathy. I thought back to the early days of our marriage, before the lies, before Ryan, before everything fell apart. I had loved her once, deeply. And now here she was, broken, defeated, a shadow of the woman I had built a life with. I should have felt triumphant. I should have walked out of there with my head held high, but instead, I felt hollow. The battle was over, but it didn't feel like a victory. My attorney, Harris, touched my shoulder gently. "You did it, Jack. It's over now." His voice was low, calm, almost reassuring. I nodded, more out of reflex than anything else. "Yeah," I muttered. "It's over." I didn't feel over. I felt like I was still standing in the middle of the storm, waiting for the next strike of lightning. As we turned to leave, I heard the scrape of a chair behind me. Emily was standing now, her hands gripping the table so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked up, her eyes locking onto mine. There was no smirk, no defiance, just exhaustion. Her lips parted, but she hesitated, like she wasn't sure what to say, or if she should say anything at all. I stopped, meeting her gaze, waiting. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you're happy." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and sharp. Harris shifted beside me, uncomfortable, but I didn't move. I could see the cracks in her facade now, the mask she'd worn for so long finally crumbling. I had spent months imagining what this moment would feel like, imagining her regret, her humiliation, her pain. But now that it was here, I didn't feel satisfaction. I just felt tired. "Emily," I said, my voice steady but quiet, "this isn't about me being happy. This is about what's right." She looked away, her shoulders slumping. For a second, I thought she might argue, might lash out or try to blame me for everything that had happened. But she didn't. She just nodded, barely perceptible, and sat back down. I turned and walked out of the courtroom, Harris at my side. The hallway was bright, almost harsh, after the heavy atmosphere of the courtroom. Reporters lingered near the doors, their cameras and notebooks ready, but I ignored them. My focus was on the endgame, on Liam, on making sure he had the stability and safety he needed. The rest didn't matter anymore. Harris cleared his throat as we reached the exit. "You know, it's not often these things go this smoothly. You should be proud." I glanced at him, then back at the glass doors ahead. Yeah, I guess so. He gave me a small, understanding smile. Look, Jack, I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you did the right thing. For Liam. For yourself. I nodded, appreciating his words even if they didn't quite sink in yet. Thanks, Harris. We stepped outside, and the cool air hit me like a slap. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. I inhaled deeply, trying to shake off the weight of the day. My car was parked a few rows down, and I made my way toward it, Harris walking with me. What now? He asked. I shrugged. I go home. Take care of my son. Try to figure out what normal looks like after all this. He nodded, and we walked in silence the rest of the way. When we reached my car, he stopped and offered his hand. You've got my number if you need anything else. I shook his hand firmly. Thanks. For everything. He nodded once more, then turned and walked back toward his own car. I got in, closed the door, and just sat there for a moment. The courthouse loomed in my rearview mirror, a reminder of everything we'd just been through. I glanced at the passenger seat, at the empty space where Emily had once sat, back when we were just a couple getting through life together. It felt like another lifetime. I let out a slow breath and turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, a steady, comforting sound that grounded me. I pulled out of the lot and headed toward home. The drive was quiet, the roads nearly empty. As I turned onto my street, I felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. I'd won at least on paper, but the reality of what came next was still unknown. Liam would be waiting for me, and I'd have to explain what had happened, why his life was going to look a little different from now on. I'd have to be strong for him, to show him that no matter what had happened between his mom and me, he was still loved, still safe. That was all that mattered now. I pulled into the driveway and shut off the engine. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the house. It looked the same as it always had, but it felt different. It felt like a fresh start and a heavy responsibility all at once. I grabbed my bag, stepped out, and walked up to the door. The weight of the day lingered on my shoulders, but as I opened the door and heard Liam's voice calling from the living room, I knew I'd made it through the hardest part. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to hope. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the afternoon had given way to evening, and the soft glow of porch lights up and down the street cast a kind of quiet peace over the neighborhood. I sat there in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, letting the events of the day wash over me. The courtroom scene played on repeat in my mind, the judge's words, Emily's defeated posture, the way her lawyer had barely been able to keep his composure. It was done. Everything we'd been fighting over for months was finally resolved. And yet, I felt more drained than triumphant. Maybe I had expected some kind of emotional release, some rush of satisfaction when the gavel came down. But all I felt was tired. Inside the house, the faint sound of the television reached me as I opened the door. Liam was on the couch, his small frame curled up under a blanket. He looked up when he saw me, his face lighting up with the kind of smile that made everything else fade away. "Dad," he called out, jumping up and running over. I knelt down as he barreled into my arms, holding him close. He smelled like soap and clean laundry, and the warmth of his hug seemed to push all the heaviness of the day out of my chest. "How was school, buddy?" I asked, ruffling his hair as I pulled back to look at him. "Good," he said with a grin. "I got an A on my math test." I grinned back, proud and relieved. "That's awesome. I knew you could do it." He beamed, then turned serious. "Dad, is everything okay now? You said you had to go to court today. Is it all done?" I hesitated for a split second, then nodded. "Yeah, kiddo. It's all done. Do I still get to stay here? With you?" I squeezed his shoulders gently, looking him right in the eye. "You're staying right here. This is our home. We're not going anywhere." His smile returned, and he let out a little breath of relief. "Good. I like it here." "So do I," I said, standing up and tousling his hair again. "What do you say we order some pizza? Celebrate that, eh?" "Yeah," he cheered, running back to the couch and picking up the TV remote. As I placed the order, I felt something shift inside me. For months, I'd been consumed by the fight, every waking moment focused on gathering evidence, preparing statements, anticipating Emily's next move. And now that it was over, I realized just how much of my energy had been drained by the constant battle. But seeing Liam's face light up, hearing his excitement over something as simple as pizza, I knew that it had all been worth it. He was safe. He was home. And that was all that mattered. The pizza arrived not long after, and we sat at the kitchen table together, laughing about the show he'd been watching and talking about his upcoming science project. He wanted to build a model rocket, and I promised we'd go to the store over the weekend to pick up supplies. It felt good, normal, even. Like we were finally getting back to the life we were supposed to have all along. After dinner, I helped Liam with his homework, something I hadn't been able to do as often as I wanted over the past few months. Sitting there at the table with him, watching him carefully solve each math problem, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. When he finished, he held up the worksheet triumphantly. "Done," he declared. "Nice work, buddy," I said, giving him a high five. "You're on a roll today." He grinned, then glanced at the clock. "Can we play a game before bed?" "Sure thing," I said. "Go pick one out." He ran off to the living room, and I leaned back in my chair, letting out a long, slow breath. This was what it was all about, being here for Liam, making sure he had the stability and support he needed. The fight in court hadn't been about winning or losing, it had been about protecting him, giving him a chance to grow up in a loving, secure environment. And now, finally, that was within reach. Liam came back with a board game, and we played at the kitchen table, laughing and teasing each other as the minutes ticked by. He didn't seem worried about the past few months. He didn't seem to carry the weight of everything that had happened between me and his mom. All he cared about was being here, with me, in the moment. And that made it all worthwhile. When it was time for bed, I tucked him in, listening as he rattled off a list of things he wanted to do over the weekend. "We'll get to it all," I promised, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "Good night, kiddo." "Good night, Dad," he said, his voice already soft and sleepy. I turned off the light and closed his door, standing in the hallway for a moment. The house was quiet now, the kind of peaceful silence I hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. I walked back to the kitchen, cleaning up the remains of dinner and putting away the game. The weight on my shoulders had lessened, but it hadn't disappeared. I knew there was still a long road ahead, adjusting to this new normal, making sure Liam was okay, and navigating whatever came next. But at least now, I could see the path forward. I sat down at the table, sipping a glass of water and staring out the window. The street was quiet, the houses still and calm. For the first time in months, I wasn't bracing myself for another fight, another attack, another piece of evidence I had to gather. I could just breathe. I thought about the judge's words, the finality of the ruling, and I felt a small, flickering sense of hope. I'd done everything I could to protect my son, and now it was up to me to give him the life he deserved. The day had been long, the journey exhausting, but as I sat there in the quiet of my home, I knew that this was only the beginning. The courtroom battle was behind us, but the real work was just starting, building a new life for me and Liam, one step at a time. And as I thought about the future, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt ready. They never saw it coming. She and her lover thought they'd won, but in the end, they lost everything: the house, the money, even their dignity. And me. I walked away with the one thing that mattered most: my son. Betrayal comes at a cost, and everyone eventually pays. What do you think? Was justice served? Comment below and let me know your thoughts. In this battle, I learned that trust is a precious commodity, one that should never be given blindly. Protecting what matters, your family, your finances, your peace, means staying vigilant, documenting everything, and being willing to fight for what's right. When betrayal strikes, don't let it break you. Instead, stand firm, gather the facts, and let the truth speak louder than any accusation. The American system can work if you use it wisely. Above all, remember, when the storm clears, what truly counts is who you have by your side.